Well. Good afternoon, Dr. Jeffries. It is my pleasure to again have you on the program, and it's an awesome program, and nobody can do this program the way you can. It is the Metropolitan Museum uh, giving African origins of civilization. The exhibit that they have, the African origins of civilization, is just a fantastic presentation. I wanted you to talk about that, and especially that they mentioned Sheikh Anta Diop, Dr. Clark, Dr. Jeffries, all of this work that y'all have been doing over the last 50 years is bearing fruit. So I'd like, first of all, for you to just tell us why this is such a critical presentation coming from the Metropolitan Museum of Art.
Well, before we get into the heavy stuff, you need to at least keep your mailbox open because when Charles and I figure out the bill, we'll send it off to Brooklyn, and so that you can look at it. Don't let your wife see it. But,
Okay.
at any rate, let's give thanks that we're both here to be able to continue to make our personal contributions and be a part of this enlightenment, this awakening of African peoples.
Yes.
So even though you've been able to make yours with the camera, I've been able to make mine in the classroom. We are part of an enormous awakening. So that's how I describe it. And then as I put my pieces together to deal with this enormous awakening, it is clear that this museum exhibit is one of the great battles that we have been waging. And it's clear that this is part of a victorious process. I used to say all the time when I was speaking, truth crushed the earth, but rise again stronger than before. And so because of the attacks on all of us, and we now have to realize that this enormous truth that we were shouting from the rooftops and from the mountaintops and from along the river valleys and the shores, this enormous truth is now clear, being affirmed by the great institutions of the European American world.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got to figure out over these next few weeks how to be able to put this enormous historical moment in the context of my 85 years. This week coming up, I'll be heading toward 85. And that means I'm at the end of my journey and not at the beginning. So I need to summarize it. And so since you have been such an important part of it, I would want you to be a part of the summarizing. But I have to tell you and Charles that I am 85. Charles, how old are you?
Sometimes I feel like I'm 85, but I'm 53.
53. That's ridiculous. You're just a youngster. And then Clemson is a little older than that because he was sitting in the classroom in front of me at the City College in 1972 or 73 or thereabout. And so Clemson has a few more years to stack on the deck than you do. Now, Clemson, how many years?
Well, I'm 82.
You see how he's been looking good, Charles.
How old is he?
But he didn't say 82, but it slipped out. 82. Clemson has been through the world, around the world, and back. And if he could just concentrate on his archives instead of be worrying about everybody else's, because there's a limitation. Time is a limitation, health is a limitation, resources is part of the limitations that we have. But we're blessed to be in this moment in world history, to be able to deliver several important blows to the system of white supremacy and to put several important foundations in place for the African truth that we've all been able to participate in unveiling. So what I'm trying to do with all of this work that we have been able to accumulate and the associations we've been able to establish and maintain, I'm entitling what I'm trying to do the triumph of Pan-Africanism and the continuing rise of the African truth. And so what I want to do is be able to put together, as I have in my teaching, a triangular process of dealing with economics, politics, and culture. That's the pyramid of analysis formulation that I have used, because when you're dealing with so much history, you got to have a process of making it work. Using the pyramid analysis would allow me to deal with the African formulation that we can call the thesis, and related to the opposite, which would be the antithesis, and the link up the thesis and the antithesis with the synthesis. In order for us to do justice to what we've been blessed with, we have to have a formula, and we have to become synthesizers. But first and foremost, we have to get the information right to get us to bounce off into the world. And then you have to see the opposites to that information that you are using. And then you take the foundation and its opposites and you synthesize it. So you have attempted to use film and other processes of the camera. You have attempted to create a synthesis as you move through the world. I have been trying to teach it and then to magnify it in terms of my other activities. So we have to see each other as synthesizers. And not all of us can be expected to be at the top of the class in that process, but all of us have to be about it. Then you have to have the contrast between the African world and the later world, the European world, and then related to the modern world. And the European world, unfortunately, as Dr. Clark and others have said, has stolen the history of African peoples and left us with an empty bag of tricks. And so we have to understand the process of the denial of African humanity. And it's been such a monumental task that African enslavement can be looked at not in terms of a weekend of slave raiding or a year or two of slave raiding or a decade of slave raiding, but hundreds of years of slave raiding that can be synthesized into thousands of years of the European, the I call it the caveman coming from the northern realm and then creating havoc in the Sun Belt. And so the African pyramidal process of the upright pyramid, I refer to our world history. And then when you turn it upside down, that refers to the instability of the European world of the caves as opposed to the African world along the riverbanks of the world. At the Schomburg Center, one of our great artists has put on the center of the lobby in the Schomburg his great poem about I have seen rivers. And when we're talking about African peoples, we really have to understand what that have meant. The great cultures and civilization rose because of the ecology of the rivers and their banks, or the mountains and their lakes. And it's these rivers that have allowed African people to be at the forefront of human development. When you're from the northern cradle, that's the European, that's the cradle of the ice, as opposed to the cradle of the sun. And so this relationship between sun people and ice people became very real for me, even though there was ridicule in the New York newspapers and magazines that Jeffries has this concept of ice people and sun people. Well, it's real. Sun people got caught up in the ice of the northern cradle, and they didn't have a chance to get back into their world of sun. And as a result, they evolved a species, a part of the human species that related to being in the caves and developing a physical posture that was prepared to handle the caves, and a lifestyle, a deep culture that reflected that. So I was trying to give the European a break when I came up with this dichotomy between sun people and ice people. Now, I was trying to do it with my growing knowledge of things, but Newsweek magazine, or one of the magazines, national magazines, decided to highlight it. Now, of course, I didn't have anything to do with that, but they had a magazine, and on the cover was a black Adam and Eve. And the black Adam and Eve reflected the ancient history that comes out of the Nile Valley and other cultures. The man and the woman who together produce humanity. Now that issue, which I will be talking about over these next couple of weeks, had a predecessor issue. In other words, the issue with the man and the woman, Adam and Eve, with their jerry curls and the rest, was significant. But before that issue came out, there was another issue by the same magazine, but it did not have a couple that symbolized the beginning of humanity. It had one man on the cover, and that man was a caveman. And they had the story of the caveman's existence. And they talked about that caveman being the real person that helped develop the human family. And in fact, they were so bold as to show how this caveman lived and how ingenious he was. In fact, he was able to take blocks of ice and build himself a cave shelter. Or if you want to exaggerate, his cave castle in the ice. And they even had nerve enough to show a picture of the caveman's achievement in terms of building a home for himself. And they had pictures of how he was able to take mammoth bones, these huge bones of the ancient animal families, and stack them together to produce a structure that gave him protection on the cold plains of the European ice land. And they called it a Russian something, on a motel on the Russian plains. I like to refer to it as the Bone Motel. Now, that great achievement of survival culture by the European should be acknowledged. But there's no way that you can compare the achievements along the river valleys of the world in every continent. And so the pyramids, the great pyramids, the great building of Egypt was built along the riverbanks. And there were no bones in the structure. They hewn out of the living rock in parts of the river valleys that produce granite. You can't get any sturdier, stronger building block than granite. And then to have the ingenuity, not just to stack them together for protection, but to stack them by the millions in order to reflect the human existence with the existence of that beyond the human, which we refer to as God. The Egyptians have evidence, the ancient Egyptians have evidence of this great building to their God consciousness. And it was a building that took place around the complementarity of the male and the female principle, and the process of eternal life and rebirth and resurrection. All of these deep concepts come out of the life of Africans along the rivers and in the great valleys of the world. And to have the European newspapers just place the Iceman on the cover and not even give him an ice lady to be with. And then to have his great achievement living in the caves or on the plains by stacking mammoth bones. That's a great tribute to survival culture, but it cannot be compared to developmental culture of people in the sun. So you have these two magazine covers that I hope I'll be able to, I know I have them in the files, and I'll be able to make copies so people can have that type of comparison. So Africans moved on a heavy path into high culture and civilization in these various historical periods. So we have to be able to look at, again, using the pyramidal process for the African, his early development, which relates to later development, which relates to modern development. And so that it's looking at the flow of humanity and linking it to historical periods, which is what I've been blessed to be about. And so that you're sitting at the feet of these masters who had mastered this process. And certainly in the context of Africa, sitting at the feet of the masters has been one of the techniques that our people use to transfer knowledge. And if we use the reference of Africans sitting alongside the river valleys and the lakes, transferring this knowledge from mouth to ear, and having organized groups like the Young Men's Society or the Young Women's Society, so women elders can transfer this knowledge to them. That the whole process of transferring what has been gained by previous generations is the educational socialization that Africans contributed. there's not much that the Northern Cradle could have contributed to this type of activity because they really spoke in grunts and groans, although they have pictures in the caves of the Northern Cradle inhabitants and survivalists making some drawings on the cave of animals and other circumstances, but they can't compare to the systemic process of images created by the lake dwellers, by the people who lived along the riverbanks. And that's why this whole legacy from the Nile Valley and the other river valleys has been captivated and preserved in institutions, organizations, into papyri, in other words, a special form of paper, into sculptures and whatnot. So the Northern Cradle, Southern Cradle relationship is a theme that has to be developed. And the process of the Northern Cradle warrior invading the lands to the south needs to be understood, because in the modern day we call it colonialism. 100 years before we called it enslavement and invasion and destruction. And so we really want to be able to gather information and analysis around these two levels of our human family's growth and development. Now, there have been individuals who've been blessed to get into this knowledge in a very deep way, and they've almost created a sacred process of transferring of knowledge. And in so doing, they're dealing with economics, survival, developmental, controlling your growth and development. And then in order to control your growth and development, you need politics to manage that growth and development in order to sustain it over periods of time, including hundreds and thousands of years and millennia. Then you have to have culture. So the European likes to divide up things and have his economics in one building of his university, and then his politics taught in another building of his university, and then some cultural institutions like churches and social organizational structures. But there has to be a relationship between these institutions, and Africans and their cousins in the Sun Belt created these institutions of learning, transferring the great knowledge that is necessary to sustain the family. So am I looking at history and trying to make comparisons? We have the Northern Cradle of the ice and the Southern Cradle of the sun. And some of our great scholars have helped me develop these concepts. And one of them is Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop, one of the greatest minds that ever walked the earth. And Dr. Diop, who was from the Republic of Senegal, the modern state, he was able to continue his great contribution by bonding with others. And one of the key persons that he was able to bond with was a mentor. And so this great brother, Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop from Senegal, was able to bond with a mentor, Alioune Diop. No relationship, it's just a popular name in Senegal, just like Smith and Jones is a popular name in America. But Alian Diop, a senior of the great Cheikh Anta, he wasn't an individual by himself. He had a partner, and his partner was Madame Diop. And they developed an institution strategically placed in Paris on the West Bank, where you had the university concentrations. The great university in France was Sorbonne, and it was a pillared temple being inspired by the Greeks with their pillared temples, which inspired the Africans, helped to inspire the Greeks in their understanding of the ancient knowledge. And then down from the pillared temple, the Sorbonne, you have a smaller pillared temple, and it's called the undergraduate French school, the École de France. In other words, you get your first degree at the French undergraduate school, École de France, and then when you pass that level, then you move on to the Sorbonne. Now, interesting enough, between the Sorbonne and the École de France, there was a special building, and that was the office, the meeting place, the think tank of the printing establishment of Présence Africaine. And that was the institution that Alian Diop, the mentor of and Madame Diop, the wife of Alian, they have maintained that institution. Even to this day, it's publishing the great works of our scholars. And even to this day, it's producing important contributions. I had a chance to personally become involved with the great struggle that went on in 1959-60, when Cheikh Anta Diop, the young, brilliant scholar, was trying to produce his dissertation, doctorate presentation, but he wasn't accepted. His work was not good enough. And so when I was studying in Europe in 1959-60, I was learning from some of the best European professors, Professor Oles in Switzerland, Professor Jacquard, who was the head of the research institute there, and Professor Ribin. So these great European professors opened my mind in 1959-60 to a world that I had not any real knowledge about. And they were talking about how this world can reach the point of destruction as it happened in Europe with World War I, and again in Europe in World War II. And so the scholars were meeting on how they could rebuild Europe. And Professor Ribin, he was the architect of the common market and the European Union. And Professor Ribin also was interested in the economics of river valleys. And so they had a whole economic analysis that blew my mind, because they were saying that the Europeans cannot get up off the ground, having all their cities destroyed and their industries destroyed as well. They could not, they have to band together, have a common market, a collectivity, the way the Africans' cultures and civilization were carried on. And the key was the development of the coal and steel industry in the Ruhr Valley, which runs between France and Germany. and the and Belgium. And so what I was taught with the other European youngsters is that no nation should be wealthy enough to have a 100-day steel strike and waste all of that time and effort, and that was lost to the development. And so I was the only, of 250 students, I was the only American there, white or black. And the students, once this indictment against no nation should be wealthy enough to waste energy and effort with the 100-day steel strike, the students looked back at me, turned around and looked back at me. I usually sat in the back. And so I had to shout out that I'm a Black American. I didn't know. I took part of that American title off of my shoulders and didn't take responsibility for such a wasteful economic. But at any rate, at the same time, learning from these European professors, I also had a chance with a voice that told me, go to Paris. And, you know, I had been to Paris and visited it. I had been to Champs-Élysées, but I didn't lose anything on Champs-Élysées. I didn't need to buy any fancy jewelry. I didn't need to visit the women in Pigalle. I didn't need to go to the holy places, Notre Dame and Sacré-Cœur in another part of Paris. But the Spirit said, go to the West Bank. And the West Bank was the student quarters. And I answered that call. I left Geneva and left Lausanne in Switzerland and went to Paris to the West Bank. And that's when I met Alioune Diop and others. There were hundreds, if not thousands, of people there to encourage Cheikh Anta Diop in defending his dissertation. They had 100 or so scholars that Alioune brought, white, European, as well as African scholars, to sit in judgment of this team of professors that was going to decide whether for the third time he would fail to get his doctorate. But the spirit of struggle was so great. And I was glad that I was a part of it. And so finally, Cheikh Anta Diop was able to get his dissertation passed, and he began to grow even greater, because not only did he have knowledge in history and sociology, but he was a scientist, and he worked in special laboratories under special conditions. They called these laboratories the French IFAN, the French Fundamental Institution. And in fact, he was in charge of a nuclear laboratory right outside of the entrance to Dakar, the University of Dakar in Senegal. So it was more than a classroom knowledge that I obtained in Europe. It was a knowledge of how you look at history, how you relate it to people, how you apply it to real circumstances. Mm-hmm. And so as we look at this modern situation that we now have, the current one, in reference to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, Diop's great work, Civilization and Barbarism, was complemented by his other great works in reference to Africa. And he was considered, he wasn't recognized even by his own people. They were afraid of his strength, and he was not allowed to get a teaching position in the Senegalese university by his own document. And this is a conflict between Leopold Sédar Senghor, one of the greatest Africans to receive education in the French tradition, He went past the doctorate. He went for the agrégé. That's beyond the doctorate, a super doctorate. And Senghor was a moderate socialist. Cheikh Anta Diop was a radical socialist. And so their political differences kept them from connecting. And Senghor blocked Cheikh Anta Diop from doing many things. In fact, when I had a chance to set up the Black Studies Department at City College in New York, and we had a chance to have a major conference on human development, the president of the City College, who was a great Jewish scientist who helped develop the atomic bomb, there was a conflict in the classroom at City, and one of our students who had our classes, meaning classes with Professor Jeffries, Professor Scobie, Professor Amodin, Professor Botchue, professors from the Caribbean. Scobie was from Dominica. Professor Larocque was from Haiti. This enlightenment coming to our students got to the point where one of the student leaders went into the classroom of a professor who said Africa had no history or culture worthy of consideration. And so this young man, Michael, a student leader, Mike Edwards, he took the books of Dr. Diop, the books of Dr. Ben, who had a specialty in the Nile Valley, the books of Dr. Clark and his mentor, John Jackson, the books of Walter Rodney and others who dealt with modern nation building. And he went into the classroom. The students were a little anxious in terms of what was happening. And he told the professor, and the professor said, well, can I help you? What are you doing in my classroom? And he said, I came here to teach the truth. And the teacher said, you did what? And he said, yes, I brought these books and whatnot so that these students can get the truth. And the teacher was kind of flustered and he didn't quite know what to do. So he canceled the class. And then he went out and got the security guards to remove this young man. By the time he came back, the young man had used the Jeffries technique of putting books up on the blackboard and illustrating the ideas on the blackboard and letting the students know that this knowledge is not something out of the air. It's been published and it's been challenged. And so the professor came in with the security guard, and then luckily it was a black security guard, because when the professor tried to get the class to remove Michael Edwards, Mike and the student said, he cancels his class. This is another, and that's what the guard said. The guard said, it's obvious that this is another class going on, Professor. So he did not remove Mike, and Mike taught the class. And that opened up a war between our African truth and the big lie of European supremacy. It was actually in the classroom as the ground zero of the struggle. And so we eventually had a war that spread not only in that one classroom of Mike Edwards or in my other classrooms in my department, it spread across the nation, it spread across the hemisphere. It went all the way down into Brazil. It spread to Europe. And so this great struggle for this African truth has its deep roots in the activities that many of us had a chance to be a part of. And it's still going on after all of these years, and it will continue. But we're on the victorious side of it. Now, when there was the problem that I described with the student leader and the professor saying that Africa did not have any real foundation in human development, President Marshak the Jewish scientists who helped to develop the atomic bomb said that, he called me in the office. He said, Dr. Jeffries, we know that the college is very tense and tight with all of this struggle over who has the truth and who hasn't. My suggestion is that we have an international conference on early civilization. And then I said, well, tell me more, Bob. I try to get familiar with Dr. Marshak. I said, well, let me hear more of your ideas. He said, well, we once had a big problem over in science, and we decided to have a world conference. My suggestion is that City College sponsor a world conference on early civilization. So I said, well, it sounds damn good to me. What do you suggest? He said, well, we'll set aside some money to be able to do it. And I got a big deal and said, I'll set aside some of my budget so that we can do it. And then we'll get other institutions where some of our people are, like Dr. John Henry Clark is at Hunter, and Dr. Tilden Lamel is with him. And then Dr. Feti Kojo from Ghana is at Queen's College. We have our brothers from Nigeria, Dr. Amoda, and we have Dr. Bachwe from Ghana. So we have an international faculty. And so we will make our contribution. And sure enough, we are able to get a reasonable donation from one of the foundations. And we had this international conference planned out. And I told Marshak, President Marshak, you could bring anybody you want. All we need is one person, Dr. Shekanta Diop. And so I said, we have locally the others who can complement him, Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben and Dr. Jackson and Dr. Clark's teacher. And we have scholars from New York that are in the city university system that would be glad to participate. So we set it up, had a working committee, and we sent a ticket to Dr. Shekanta Diop to come, and he agreed to come and to be a part of it, to open it up. And then they would have a European scholar to be in the mix with him. And then the second day, we'd have another scholar, Dr. Clark, open it up with contesting a European scholar. And then the third day, it would be Dr. Jeffries and another European scholar. And so this fantastic conference actually took place. Marshak had said, we'll suspend regular classes and we'll have this conference in the Great Hall. Now, this is mind-blowing. The Great Hall was a Gothic structure like a great cathedral in Europe. And it was the center piece of the City College Gothic buildings on the campus. And you could have seated in it 1,000 or almost 2,000 people. And so for us to suspend regular classes and have a week of this question of civilization was a great achievement. But there was a big problem. We sent the ticket for Shekanta Diop to come to open the conference for us, but Sangor would not let him get a visa. So he could not get the plane flight to come. And I told President Marshak, don't worry about it. We have people who can step into his shoes. And so I said, we'll just raise Dr. Clark up from second day. We'll make him first day. We'll move Professor Scobie up to the second day, and then I will put the final on it. And so that's what we did. We had this enormous conference rotating all of the college classes through the Great Hall to see this great statement. And luckily, to the world, we had Bruce Williams an article by Bruce Williams that dealt with the lost pharaohs of Nubia. And in fact, we invited Bruce Williams to come to the conference, and he did. We invited others like Dr. Ivan Van Sertima to come, and he eventually set up a journal of African civilization, inspired by all of this work that has been going on. And he did his PhD work on the cultures and civilizations in the Americas. And so there's an article that Bruce Williams had published. He was at the University of Chicago, and actually we took that article and we made thousands of copies of it. And so our seriousness was very real. Our success was clear. And so that we were able to link up with other African American, African Caribbean brothers and sisters taking on the same path that we did of challenging the truth of the European lie. And so in Philadelphia, we had brothers who emerged around Temple University and the other universities in Philadelphia. In Atlanta, we had a group of scholar warriors who emerged. And one of them was Dr. Asa Hilliard and a crew of people in Atlanta. And so the concept of the scholar warrior became a part of the American academic arena. And so we were at war with knowledge and putting the lie to the European concept of superiority. And so here is the New York scholar warriors. And that includes at the center, Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben. Dr. Ben gave us the Nile Valley. He was an expert in the Nile Valley. Dr. Clark was an expert in the history of the African world. Next to him is Professor Scobie. He came from the Caribbean and was a wonderful addition to our faculty because he was an RAF pilot. He had taught, he had written books and published Black Britannia and other books in England. He was a BBC correspondent. And then to his right is myself. And I had my special education. At the other side is Dr. John, is Professor Small. And he represented the struggle in America because he was very close to Malcolm X. So this was just the family of scholars in the New York area. They had the same type of group in Chicago around Dr. Jacob Carruthers and the various educational institutes in Chicago. In fact, they set up a special institute, the Kemetic Institute, to study the Nile Valley. Atlanta, the complex of organizations in the Atlanta complex that include Morehouse, the men's school, Spelman, the female school, Atlanta University, which also had a graduate component, the International Seminary dealing with theology, Morris Brown. So you had these institutions and organizations teaching the normal history. Now they were interested in teaching the deeper history about Africa and the ancient world.
Kenware Science Consortium, Melanin, Diop Melanin, Kenware, and M3.
Right. And my partner for life, Dr. Rosalynn Jeffries, who actually has been a leader in this African consciousness. In fact, she went to Africa first. I went in 61, but she went in 60 with this program of Operation Crossroads Africa. And many of our scholar buddies went in the different years. But we were able to expand these schools of knowledge into several important areas of exploration. And Diop and others had opened up this possibility of melanin and its significance. And so we got a number of our people together, and we were able to put on a ChemWare conference
Science Consortium.
that took advantage of the work of Cheikh Anta Diop, that we were able to get the psychologists and the chemists and whatnot. And so out of the conference we had on melanin came a science consortium. And so you had the African world of Diop connected to the science of our schools here in America. And you hooked up with important institutional centers such as Detroit. And they created this consortium, M3 was the symbolic code. And they were able to sponsor a conference that allowed us to go overseas and to the Nile Valley. And so that the creation of other brothers who had different disciplines than history and politics and economics. So you had people who were dealing with the mind, Francis Cress Welsing, Dr. Pat Newton, people dealing with psychology, Dr. Wade Nobles, Dr. Richard King came up with the Black Dot Theory, and a number of us. So there was a spread of this consciousness among our people, and they put it in key important institutions, and they organized associations as well as having trips to out of the country to Africa, for example. And one of the results of this activity was a conference they had in the Nile. It's all the way in the back, Charles. The last one. You see the wings? Yeah, yes. That we had conferences in Ghana. We had conferences in Dakar, Senegal. We had conferences in Ethiopia. We had conferences in Atlanta. And so this explosion of information allowed us to have this conference honoring Cheikh Anta Diop. In fact, he was supposed to come to the conference. Again, he was blocked. He did not make the conference that was scheduled because the plane had trouble. And so he went back. But this was the conference in celebration of the great work of our ancestors and leaders. Dr. Benjamin Mays was the great leader of Morehouse College. And then the topics was the Nile Valley, the cradle of civilization, the Nile Valley, a dynastic overview. And the people involved included Dr. Kofer, who was a PhD in theology, Dr. Hilliard in education, Dr. John Jackson, the teacher of Dr. Clark, LeGrand Clegg, MD, but he was interested in ancient history. Ivan Van Sertima, who came from the Caribbean, he came from Guyana, and Jan Carew, who came from Suriname. Bruce Williams, the last person, is Bruce Williams, who was the European who participated, and there he is, Bruce Williams, PhD, and it was at the International Martin Luther King Center in the heart of the Morehouse campus. So
All about melanin.
and so we took these topics: history, politics, science, the cognitive, the skin, melanin, as the pigment, the
Adelaide
black
Sanford.
pigment, and then others were involved. The sisters were all involved. Regent Adelaide Sanford,
And the melanin, the New York Times got challenged.
and she was part of our group and one of the great educators. In fact, she was one of the leading educators in New York,
Curriculum of
and
inclusion.
she got involved in the struggle of looking at putting the truth in the New York curriculum. And so I was asked to be a part of it, to organize scholars to deal with the African American component. Someone else was selected to deal with the Latino component. Someone else was selected to deal with the Asian component. And so we've had a chance to work with others dealing with this explosion of information about knowledge and to take the European off of his pedestal where he put himself without acknowledging on whose foundation was he building his world on. And so now we've made the challenge. It's been serious, and it's been global. As my wife pointed out, we impacted on the psychology of the mind and the understanding of the cosmic universe. We're exploring new ideas there. We were talking of a new theology that allowed us to get into deep cultural understanding. And some of that cultural understanding was such that you had a living African king, part of the great Asante Empire. And this brother was so glad to see us coming and relating to his people that he brought us into the heart of the Ashanti. We related not only to the great king, we related to the king maker, the one who installed the great kings. And that elder adopted us along with the king. And then
That's Ashanti.
the king's name was the Asantahini, and they had a female component to their spirituality and their governance. And this was the great Queen Mother, Nana Afuasa. So we were able to not just go to Ghana to help build schools and to have other work camp projects, but we were absorbed into understanding their great cultures and then bringing them onto the world stage. This great Asantahini, whose the tradition is that from the gold stool was brought down from heaven by the chief priestess to be the sacred symbol around which the Ashanti organized their world. And they organized a wonderful world, just as others from the tradition of the Yoruba or the Igbo or the various other groups in Africa. They were not savages. They had a serious understanding of the universe, and they built their world around their understanding. So we were asked to participate in various activities, including the stool every year had to be acknowledged. And so and they brought the golden stool out for these events. And we were able to participate in them. And the great Ashanti art was rated and the British were trying to sit on the Golden Stool, which was an insult. And so they had a war with the Ashanti, and they tried to burn down some of their holy spaces. But they took hundreds of pieces of their art back to London. Now here they are dealing with supposedly people that wasn't worthy, but they still were able to try to sit on their sacred spaces. And then they took, and they actually had a war because of that. And it was led by one of the priestess, Yah Santiwa, and the greatest priestess. And then they, just as they raided the Yoruba land and raided Benin and raided other places, they took the art back to Europe. And it was
Divine kingship in Egypt.
this whole concept of African rulership and divine kingship was a part of these deep traditions. And so the great artwork was on display in London, and the priest that you see here, the great king that you see here, was with his chief linguist, and they walked into the great castle in London, and they were supposed to have a banquet honoring the Ashanti king. And when they walked in, the senior linguist made it clear that they couldn't go any further, and he held the king. He told the king to halt, and because what had happened was the banquet table that was before them was decorated with kente cloth, special woven cloth that the Ashanti people had developed, and others in the Akan tradition. And so the senior linguist said we would have to leave, and we cannot desecrate our sacred processes. And so they turned around and they left. Now this artwork became the source of international movement, and it was moved out of England and shown at the Museum of Natural History in New York, which is the sister museum of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, which is on one side of Central Park, on the Fifth Avenue side, and the Museum of Natural History is on the, I believe, the Amsterdam side. But what happened there was one of our African American friends had said that he did not think it appropriate for this material to be floating around called the Kingdom of Gold. It was the part of the raid that had been made in trying to defeat the Ashanti. So this brother from America, one of the African Americans, he said, and he was married to an Ashanti, he said that the Ashanti should not come, the king shouldn't come with this insult of having had this legacy stolen. And so he told the people around the museum exhibit that he would take measures to block this thing from happening. And so he was able to, with his contacts in Kumasi, the capital of the Ashanti, to tell the leadership there that there would be a possibility of having African Americans oppose the bringing of this stolen material. And he actually kept talking about how this could be. And he mentioned that there were African Americans who would block it. And one of those African Americans was Dr. Jeffries at the City College of New York, the head of the Black Studies Department, one of the leaders of associations relating to Africa, like the African Heritage Studies Association and the National Council for Black Studies, and a whole host of other organizations. And so Jeffries would block it. Well, fortunately, the Africans got this news, and that meant they had to investigate who blocked the king. Who they've got to protect the king. So they had a meeting on Lenox Avenue and 120th Street, and it was a palaver, Africans meeting to discuss a problem. And so there were four of us, Professor Small, myself, Brother Lionel, and Brother Carboner, and there was about 20 of them. And we had this discussion. Now we were kind of out, they had the heavyweights there. And we had this discussion about this exhibit and about blocking of the king. And then finally, after a couple hours of discussion, from the back came a voice that said, I understand what's happening. And he came to the front and took over. And he said, Dr. Jeffries is not against the Ashanti and the king. He wants to make sure that the king and the Ashanti people and the art is treated properly. So this particular individual, a small statured man, was the giant among Ashanti. He's the senior linguist. And he made the decision that they would, in other words, there wouldn't be any conflict between us. They would work with us in having this exhibit. And so the exhibit came because it was scheduled to come. But what we decided was to complement the exhibit. We would not have just people going and gawking at the gold and whatnot. We would bring the exhibit alive. We would show African culture, not sitting in a museum or even in a great institution like the New York had. But they wanted to show the culture was still alive. It's not a museum piece. And so we planned to have a grand Durbar in New York at the City College Great Field. And so that we had the processions to the museum where the great king and others were walking with their umbrellas, and the Mayor Koch and others came to be seen. And then we put on for the first time in America a grand Durbar in the style that you would have it in the great African traditional cities. And we had the umbrellas. We had the various groups. Nana Dene Zulu had a cultural group, and a whole host of others came out with their cultural groups and their African attire and their important symbols. And so this became such a success that the king came with his wife and with his elder son. And people were pleasantly shocked to see that we could emulate what they do in Kumasi and other great cities in Africa. And this also was so successful that it was decided to make it an annual affair. So not only did we bring first and foremost the Ashanti king, the king of kings, but the next year we brought the Fanti king, Nana Mbra. And the Fanti king was brought, and the same type of ceremony was had for him, but we did it on the college campus. And we planted trees as memorials to the Ashanti king coming and participating. The Fanti and Ashanti, they're both Akan from that large cultural group, but they're different segments of it. And then the next year, we brought the Nana Mbra was the Fanti, but we brought the Ga king. And again, the same type of ceremony was had. And Dr. John Henry Clark had been installed as a chief among the Ga, because there was that ethnic group had a large population in the section of Accra where Dr. Clark lived for several years when he left America to spend some time in Africa. And then he met his great brother, Kwame Nkrumah, who was the president, who became the president of Ghana. And so what I would want to do, and this is what I'm trying to lay out in a very, thanks to my wife, in a very significant way, that African leaders believe that there should be a unity among them. And in the 50s and 60s, they developed what we call Pan-Africanism. And in 1945, they had a great conference on Pan-Africanism. And out of this struggle of Pan-Africanism, many nations were birthed. And they formed an organization referred to as the African Organization of African Unity. And that organization has been the key to the struggle for independence. And this is many of the leaders of this organization eventually was expanded and renewed to be the African Union as opposed to the Organization of African Unity. Now, interesting enough, in the early, when this organization was formed, El-Haj Malik El-Shabazz, Malcolm X, was on his movement in history, and he had gone to Mecca and had done his Hajj. And so instead of him being, and he took on the name El-Haj Malik El-Shabazz. But coming back from Cairo after the pilgrimage in Mecca, he was on one of the large boats that run up and down the Nile, that cruise the Nile. And on one of the boats that he was on, meetings of the new African Union were taking place. And so Malcolm X of the American struggle was in Mecca and then came to Cairo, met these African leaders, and was so impressed that they were meeting to put their nations together to struggle for their people, that he said that the African Americans should have this type of an organization and should link up with these Africans. So he formed the OAAU, which is the Organization of Afro-American Unity. And all of this is happening in 1963, 64, 65. That happens to be the time that my wife and I are moving around Africa. As I said, in 1960, she went to Nigeria with the Operation Crossroads Africa. I met the founder of that program, Reverend Robinson, Dr. Robinson. He had gone to Lincoln University with Nkrumah. They were partners in one of the most significant universities in the United States because it had an Afro-American link to the continent. Nnamdi Azikiwe, who became the president of Nigeria, was schooled at that school and also was a teacher. And so there. And so Nnamdi Azikiwe was the leader of the independence movement for Nigeria. So these historical moments have come together. We've been fortunate to be eyewitness and to be participating in them. And so Brother Smalls, for example, became an associate. Professor James Small became one of our partners at City College, heading the student center. And then he also became part of the staff at City College. And but the idea of seeing these former colonies now demanding independence has to be understood. And that's one of the things that I want to be able to put forth, because not only were we eyewitnesses, we helped to encourage this whole process by putting it in the academic arena. And so Dr. Clark becomes the our leader in terms of Pan-Africanism and linking African nations together. Dr. Ben, whose family roots go back to Ethiopia and before Haile Selassie's time. And so you had these two Harlemite giants who helped to link us to even an even greater part of our history. And Dr. Clark and Dr. Ben became a team, one dealing with West Africa and the rest of Africa, and one dealing with the Nile Valley. And the Nile Valley stretches, largest river in the world, stretches thousands of miles into Africa, into the heart of Africa. And then we had our foothold into institutions such as Columbia University. I went there as a student, and I've got my after I got my Lafayette degree, BA, and then focusing on political science and economic development. That was from Lafayette College. At the same time, my wife and others were at their schools like NYU, and eventually my wife went to Yale University and got their heavy degrees in serious study. I went from Lafayette, and Lafayette College on a football weekend is when I met Dr. James Robinson. By that time, my wife had already been to Nigeria with Dr. Robinson. So in 61, I went to Ivory Coast. In 61, 62, I led the group to Senegal. 63, I led the group to Guinea. 64, I was in charge of all of West Africa and French-speaking Africa. And I was getting my degrees at the same time. And one of the great professors I had, the only Black professor I've ever had at the college level, was Dr. Elliot Skinner, who eventually became Ambassador Skinner, ambassador to Upper Volta, which was a neighboring country to the Ivory Coast. And Elliot Skinner was an anthropologist. And so he adopted us as family and nurturing us, myself, other scholars that were in his classes, Dr. Richard Hope, whose grandfather helped to expand Morehouse. You had other scholars, such as Dr. Herschel. She became Challoner when she got married, but she was Herschel Sullivan when we were going to school. And among the people that were related to us was not only Dick Hope, but you had John Kennard, and he was a brother who came up from the Southern institutions, and the institution that he came from was in Carolinas, and that institution, in the historical flow of things, was important because that's where Agri of Africa went to school in the Black American Southern education. And it was Agri of Africa who got the knowledge of our Black struggle here in America. And then he took that knowledge after 20 years in America, he took it to Ghana. And so he set up the Agri School, which was a school that in Nkrumah got his initial grounding. And so this relationship of these men and women, some professors, some preachers, this enormous mix is what we've inherited. And very few of us have had the chance to be in the middle of it, like my wife and I. but enough of us have been so that when we had our marriage in 1964, you had in our wedding my brother, who was um, my best man, but you had in the wedding Donald Stewart, who was a young black man who eventually became interested in the um, the world. And I was told by Dr. Robinson to see him. He was working for the Rockefeller Foundation in Nigeria. So we became good friends. And Donald Stewart eventually was selected by the powerful woman of Spelman to be the president, the first black president of Spelman. Now, the people who made the selection were people like Marion Wright, who got married to one of the staff writers of Kennedy, and Marion Wright took on his married name, Edelson. And so Marion was one of those women who had gone to Crossroads along with Isabel Stewart. And Isabel Stewart eventually married Donald, and they produced a base of Africanists. In fact, Isabel Stewart, their son, married this sister who came up with her great work, The New Jim Crow. And she, a brilliant woman, and her sister was the office mate at Ohio State of my nephew, Dr. Hassan Jeffries. And she made sure that she protected Hassan. Now, Hassan is doing that same thing with other scholars. So it's this relationship that has to be understood as the glue that kept us cement, and as the honey that was the sucker that we were able to reach high and take all of this knowledge and put it in this flow of humanity that's creating organizations that allowed for so many leaders to come together, that created institutions that they have in Addis Ababa, the seat of this Pan-African political, economic, and cultural unity. And then attached to these institutions are these universities, like the University of Dakar, which now has 4 branches, like the University of Nigeria, which has several branches. And out of the University of Nigeria at Ibadan, they were able to create, just for the Yoruba, the University of Ife. And in the University of Ife built a new campus with this new information. Professor Akinjobin, who lived with my wife and I, as I brought him as a visiting professor of the city, he lived with us for 2 or 3 years and helped us with the research. He went to England with us when we went to meet in 72, Basil Davidson, a white scholar who had done Black Mother and all serious works on Africa. We went to sit at his feet in England at the Manding Conference. This was a conference on the people around Mali and whatnot. And we sat at his feet with him and Dr. Clark in discussion. And it was at the Manding Conference where Alex Haley was there. He had been working on roots, and that's in the Gambia, which is part of the Manding territory. Who was there? Kamaralai was there. He had done serious work on the Manding and Sanufo people. Who was there? Akinjobin was there. And it was at that point I said the next conference of this kind should be on the African continent. And so that was accepted. And in 73, we brought Akinjobin. It agreed that we would set up this conference. We had 3 years to do it. So in 76, we had a Yoruba Civilization Conference at the University of Ife, a brand new university built in the traditional setting of the only of Ife, but now at the world standards of one of the best universities. Ibadan was Oxford of Africa. And so the University of Ife wanted to go beyond the Oxford of Africa. They wanted to have a research institute, institution dealing with science in enormous ways. So we have little understanding of the important role we played in bringing this mix together and putting ourselves in the middle of it and sharing our fight for our humanity with others. And so, as a result of this great fight of these organizations and institutions, came a modern process, and our scholars, such as Dr. Clark, continued to produce his great works, but they were paired now with Dr. Diop's associates. Dr. Diop, one of his key associates is Theophile Obama. And Theophile produced this great work, Theophile Ubanga, African Philosophy, the Pharaonic Period, 2,800 BC to 330 BC. And there's the great temple built by Queen Hatshepsut in the Nile Valley. So you had this young man from the Congo, Brazza, connect with the Senegalese scholar. That was a team in New York that came to New York and became part of it. You had Dr. Clark teaming with Dr. Ben to produce a whole tradition of getting it. You had Dr. Akinjobin connecting to Leonard Jeffries, and then Leonard Jeffries and Rosa Jeffries connecting to a brother who got into a study of the gold weights in the Akan tradition in the Ivory Coast. And he actually wanted to get this work published. And he asked me and others to help. And I did contact Dr. Willie Johnson at MIT to see whether he could help get this a young man's, the scholar's work published. And he tried. And the person that had produced this great work was Dr. Nyango Mbua, who was a physically big man who liked to wear his cloth. And then he was training young people in the drumland. Drumology was one of his first books. But he got into the gold weight system as a system coming out of the Nile Valley that taught knowledge. It was not just culture and glitter. It was a whole nother way of transferring knowledge. And so he was attempting to get it published, and he wasn't successful, but he stayed on the case. And eventually there was a publishing house in Ivory Coast that published school books and other materials. And this sister took up the responsibility of getting his work published. And it was even better than anything we had planned to do, because she was able to use her facilities to film the gold weights in all kinds of positions and all kinds of culture related to it. And then she was able to present it in not one volume, but 4 volumes. And then the 4 volumes was not one language, French. It was French, and on the same page, English. I mean, this is the type of things that we help to make happen that are lost because people are worried about this and worried about that and playing these games in terms of these TV programs, etc. But there's serious work has been done that created a whole new movement of our people, and we refer to that as the African Renaissance. And so this great work of our family has to be documented. Brother Kempson Brown and others have documented a good significant part of it, but it needs to have a conference just on how do we document what we've accomplished. We're in the phase now of what I refer to as the Renaissance, the African Renaissance, the new awakening. And here is a building, that a structure that symbolizes it. It has parallel structures. It's there is a symbol in the harbor of New York that comes out of struggle and the explosion of knowledge, and it's called the Statue of Liberty. It has a parallel in the southern part, the southern hemisphere, and that parallel is the Italian population in Italy and Europe wanted to bond with the Italian population in the Americas. The largest Catholic nation in the world is Brazil. And so the Italians sent a statue of Jesus the Redeemer to be placed in a significant spot in Rio. And it was sent and it was placed overlooking this unbelievable harbor and beaches and mountains. And so Jesus the Redeemer is one of the key visits to this great city, Rio de Janeiro. And so every couple of years, we had the opportunity to go to Rio to work with our Brazilian brothers and sisters, because one of them found his way to City College, found his way to my office, and eventually we let him set up a Zumbi Institute at the City College. And then when he went back to Brazil, he related us to Brazil in a very personal way. And we would always go to the ceremonies that they had in the mountains for Zumbi, who became the spirit of fighting to overthrow slavery. And so that became our link that we tried to, and we, in fact, Genadio, who was the person who set this up, just called me this past week. It's amazing that the contact is still there. And Genadio linked us to active Brazilians who were fighting for political as well as economic power, as well as cultural power. And one of them was a Black woman, the most important Black woman in Brazil, Benedict De Sula. And she ran for the mayor of Rio, and they had a disgraceful attack on her as a Black person. But she later stayed the course. In fact, when I was with her, she wanted to have the movie Malcolm X brought to Brazil, but they banned it. But she stayed the course, and eventually she became the governor of Rio. And I have a picture here of her and one of my staff members. And we also have a picture of her and Pele, the greatest football player in history. And Pele went up to the mountain with her and myself when they had this great activity in Brazil. But we did not realize that they were not going up to the traditional yearly activity up into the mountains. The Black Brazilians had decided that this was a special occasion, and they were not going to go up into the mountains like they usually did. They were going to march, Black people march on Brasilia, the new capital built out of the jungles of Brazil. They were going to march on the new capital, designed as a new city of God. And they were going to be walking from all over Brazil, and hundreds of thousands of them did. Now, we did not know that that was going on. So we continued our process of going on our annual pilgrimage to the mountains, and you fly up to Bahia, and then you take a train from Salvador de Bahia in the northeast part of Brazil. You take a train to the foot of the mountain, and then when you get to the mountains, you take a bus up the mountain to the celebration of Zumbi. And so we did that, and when we got into our bus, the bus was so, after we got off the train, it was so raggedy that I halfway up the mountain, I said, this bus is not going to make it. And they've got to let me off. So I demanded that I get off the bus. It's not going to make it. Half the bus got off with me. And so we continued to walk up the mountain. And it took us a couple more hours, but we got it. Anderson Thompson was there. He took a picture of me walking up on the mountain. And then as soon as I got to the top of the mountain with the folks behind me, the priestess, a dozen priestess were there. And those priestess, Charles, you know what I'm talking about right over there? Those priestess saw me coming up the mountain with the people behind me, and they decided that the spirit of Zumbi has arrived. And they got together with the Babalao, and the Babalao agreed with them. And so they actually redid the ceremony, and they installed me as a part of their family and blessed me with the Ogun beads. Among this tradition in Yoruba, the god of war and struggle. And those beads were with me for some time. And in fact, I wore them at the trial in Foley Square, where we won this enormous victory over the curriculum. So what I'm saying is that you have these various traditions unfolding with us. Now, I try to be as spiritual as I can be, but of course, my wife, the female, carries the serious spirit. And just as these 12 or so priestess got to the one Babalao and said that, no, we have to celebrate this spirit coming up this hill. And the person who did have actual photos was Andy Thompson of the Kemetic Institute and the University of Chicago team of Black folks that have taken the lead. For example, Jacob Carruthers and Anderson Thompson and his team and the sisters, they set up a Kemetic Institute to study the ancient traditions. And they helped to form all of these families that on references came together in Los Angeles to try to put together a family of us to take these traditions and make it real. And it was decided that we needed to form an organization. And Dr. Ben might have had disagreements with Malana Karanga, but he connected with him. Malana Karanga was also already working with Dr. Jacob Carruthers. I brought our group from the city university. And so Asa brought his from Atlanta. So we set up what we call ASCAC, the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations. So in order to appreciate the great work that we have done and the blessings we have received, and we have to sustain them, we have to take a pause in this period of time to put together what I'm referring to as an understanding of Pan-Africanism and studying how these Africans broke the yoke of slavery and colonialism to produce the new nations. And then those new nations are unfortunately pulled by one set of colonial leaders, the French, another set of colonial leaders, the British, another set of colonial leaders, the Portuguese, another set of colonial leaders, the Belgians. So the African possibility of unity is weakened by these colonial heirs that are still there claiming that they have a right and a privilege to the continent. So there's unfinished business, and that means that we've got to have a Pan-African obligation among our people, and then we have this whole spiritual component that is wrapped around the rise of the African family. And in Senegal, President of Senegal, Wade, President of Nigeria, Obasanjo, President of South Africa, they were given the task of coming up with a symbol for the future. And that symbol for the future eventually became the rise of the family, the global family. And so it took many years to develop. The Africans designed it. They passed it on to the Koreans, who were the only people at this stage of the game that built these monumental buildings.
Engineers.
And they were the engineers, but the design was from the African heart and mind. And it was not a war memorial. It was not a memorial for a great day in history or the death of a great leader. It is a memorial to African people, to the rise of the African family. And it is the largest of its kind. And you can see it's on a acquired volcano on the cliffs along the Corniche, and that's the cliff road in Dakar. In fact, we took 350 people. We went with 350 people at the dedication, and we went to Goree Island, which people go to deal with the door of no return and the slave merchants that dominated Goree Island. After we left that, S.C. Jackson and the rest of us got on buses, and we went along the Corniche, the cliff along the river, to this monument. And when we made the turn and the bend, and I looked ahead, I did a study of Senegal that's my master's, and so I know the country up and down, but I wasn't prepared to see this monumental structure. And I yelled out, "What the hell is that?" And then when I realized that was this volcano, and on top of it was this image of the Black family rising. And so we had a chance to dedicate it with thousands of people. We had our 350 Americans, and my wife was there, as well as Wade Nobles and a whole lot of other friends of ours, and
Bill Perkins, Senator.
some political leaders from Detroit and from New York, etc. And but the interesting thing was, we sat next to a 40 to 60 person delegation of Gaddafi. We had our own section to be on, and luckily we have photos of all of this. But the beautiful thing is, they had tents set up with an exhibit, and that exhibit was put together by Dr. Cheikh Anta Diop's wife, a French woman who was also a scholar. And Rosalind knows how to make friends and connect with people. And so she had a chance to talk to his Diop's wife and their oldest son, Cheikh Mbaki, who is a scientist, a nuclear scientist.
Yes.
And so that exhibit that they put out eventually was brought inside the monument. The monument is an unbelievable structure in which you have a library, you have a theater, you have an exhibit hall, and then you can walk across the lobby and take an elevator up through the black man and black woman and up through the black man 16 stories. And then you look out on the world, the black man holding on his rock, the female, and then holding up to the universe the child of her sacred womb. And that child is not playing with the father figure. The child is pointing straight ahead. He's not pointing north to Europe, where we usually look for sustenance. He's not pointing east to Mecca, where some of us look for our holy space. He's not pointing south to the rest of the continent. The child is pointing across the Atlantic Ocean. Dakar is the closest point to Brazil and the Western world. And that child is pointing to the Africans in the New World and the link that has to be forged between them. So us. And so that's why I say that this is a much bigger process than any of us thought. It have to be about Pan-Africanism or perish. If we don't take the economic, political, and cultural units and make them into a greater Africa, it's not going to help us. And if we don't deal with the continents, the Chinese are moving continentally. The Russians are moving continentally. The Indians in India are moving continentally. And until Black folks can understand that movement that's taking place by the various groups, that whether they be Islamic or European or Asian, we have a responsibility of organizing our power and our forces and our spirituality so that we make sure that there's a future, for a meaningful future for African peoples on the planet. So this chance for us to raise these issues, we have to give credit to our brother, Clemson Brown, and his staff. And I have to give credit to my wife, because if she hasn't done the things that she's done all the years in terms of these studies of art and culture, and if she had not been praying that we somehow that could escape this war against us without destruction. And so I'm one who testified that prayer works. The right type of prayer in the right place with the right people works.
And so I could just interject very briefly and say, yes, this is the Senegalese monument to the family holding up the child and holding up the child to, but that reminds us of the African thought, but also the African American thought, because in the Alex Haley saga, when the child was born, it was said, behold that which is greater than yourself. And so we are not so much individuals, but we feel as if we have been a part of a wave that was, behold, greater than ourselves. We thank to Clemson Brown. He's here, videographer for what we are doing here. But I remember him when I was employed at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. He videoed me there. He videoed me up country in the Ivory Coast with the Nyong'o Buro, who's the head of the linguistic department at the University of Abidjan. So he happened to be around in many spots and places where you would not even think he would be. He was there with his camera.
And if it wasn't us, it would be Reverend Sharpton, Reverend Daughtry. He went and filmed some of the destruction of the African continent in the various wars, intercession wars. And he also went on the great pilgrimage to the Nile. And I remember him leaping up over the banks to get better pictures and shots. And so he has been blessed to be the sole person I know who's been in so many places at the right time and doing the correct things, such as the work in reference to Tawana Brawley and that struggle that involved every week going up to the court process and fighting for the spirit and soul of this young lady who had been accused of some monstrosities. So we're on a victorious path, and we have to make sure we appreciate and understand that the key is the family, not just the nuclear family, but the family writ large, not just the biological family, but the spiritual family, not just doing what we need to do for the yet to be born spirits that are among us, but we have to pay due respect to the ancestors because they laid the way, opened the way. And one important statement that we need to say is that Dr. John Henry Clark allowed us to sit at the feet of the masters, and one of those processes was with Dr. Mokhtar Mbai. And that brother at Dr. Clark's house became one of the most important and powerful Black men on the planet. He became the head of UNESCO. And at that meeting that we had at Dr. Clark's house, we were sitting on stools and pillows while they sat in the chairs. He was talking about what we needed to do together and wherever we are as African peoples. And so he helped get scholars, Dr. Jacob Ajay and a whole host of others, to produce an 8-volume on the African achievements. And it's significant because Theophilus Banga and Dr. Shekanta Diop in 1972 or 74, when we went up to meet with Emperor Haile Selassie and to reestablish the support for our organization, the African Heritage Studies Association, etc. Dr. Diop and Theophilus Banga were meeting at the same time in Cairo, at the famous Cairo Symposium, with scholars from everywhere. And they took them on. They were able to bring forth the truth of Africa and the ancient cultures being part of the African world. And so when we're talking about looking at some of these images and some of these circumstances, situations, we're talking about an enormous war for the mind of African peoples. And that mind for African peoples has a double meaning. The European is interested in the African mind, M-I-N-D, in order to control the African mind, M-I-N-E.
And another quick interjection, because of the women, don't forget Winnie Mandela came to Newark with WISM, the Women in Support of the Million Man March. And she was with us. She was looking for education as a sociologist herself, looking for educational answers. And we were there with an educational institution, $9 million worth of property downtown Newark. And it's no longer there, but we did what we had to do for that period of time. It was called the Dr. Adelaide Sanford Charter School.
Well, the charter school is still there. I mean, the building is still there. It was one of the most important buildings in Newark. It was the head of the Protestant church, and it was a beautiful church, and it had a fellowship hall. It had other attachments to it, and we used that as the basis for this fantastic charter school. But again, people become jealous. And Dr. Sanford worked they named it for her, and she worked with Frederica Bay. And Winnie came several times, and Dr. Betty Dotson, who has her own organizational structure with CEMOTAP, became part of the. So that building has been taken over by one of these modern institutions. But the building is still there. And the idea, it needs to be constantly kept alive, that as a result of the Million Man March, women said they were going to carve out a role and they were going to relate it to children, and they did. So it's an example of what we do in crises, what we do in response to it. and that we try to stay together in spite of all the conflicts and the difficulties that one has. And so in Newark, this coming next August will become a grand assemblage of leaders, similar to the Gary, Indiana meeting of the Black family. And when after all the sit-ins and all the urban rebellions, it was thought that we needed to come up with a global strategy. And so that is actually being planned now. Charles and myself, others are part of the planning process, and they're going to be using downtown Newark as a venue. And off of downtown Newark is one of the largest concentration of educational institutions in the world. And that's from a city that's associated with urban rebellions, a city that's associated with economic change, meaning Black populations and Latin populations moving in and taking over. But Newark has a world-class higher educational process that includes Rutgers University, that includes NJIT, the New Jersey Institute of Technology, that includes one of the better community colleges, Essex County College.
With Dr. Akil Kalfano.
Kalfani. He called me this morning from Upper Volta. He has been working as the leader of the Africana Studies at Essex County College, and he has been doing work in China, taking students to China and building bridges in that direction.
Teachers. The teachers were teaching, African-American teachers were teaching African-American history in China.
And so this call today from him was he was going to see the Morinaba. The Morinaba is the emperor of the Mosi people. The Mosi people are very important for me and my wife because one of our great brothers, Dr. Elliot Skinner, he was an anthropologist and he did a study of Africa and he did a study of the Mosi. And so that I had a chance to go on my first trip after we left Ivory Coast. We had a chance to travel to 7 nations that included Mali and Niger and Chad, Togo, Dahomey, and eventually Ghana. And so that first trip to me was a mind blower because we not only was in a new nation, Ivory Coast, with this new city that they were building from scratch, and all of the urban planning and whatnot was there. But we went up first to meet the Morinaba, and the Morinaba was the 44th ruler of over 1,000 years of rulership by these Africans that set up this kingdom, or this political structure. And so one of our great moments was when a young political leader took over the feudal government, the older government, and established a new nation. Unfortunately, Sankara, unfortunately, he was overthrown by treachery in his own staff. And so, but one of the great moments for me and him at City College was he came to America, and he also came to the City College with his entourage, and that included about 15 men, and they paraded from the parking lot through the NAC building, which was the main academic social science building, through the student center where Professor Smalls was a leader, past the cafeteria, the bookstore for the students, past the cafeteria, and then into the faculty dining room. And on the other side of the faculty dining room was the special setup for him to speak. And his men, making sure he was protected, had their submachine guns ready. So I wanted the people in City College that were trying to oppose us with all kinds of dirty tricks to understand we had a lot of bases covered, including an African leader coming into the institution of higher learning at the City College, making sure that he was protected. And since we were partnering with them, that we were protected. So, brothers and sisters, it's been a great and mighty walk in so many ways, as Alex Haley's work attests. And that great and mighty walk will continue as we fortify ourselves and link up using the symbol of the family and the monument, and using the structure of linking up organizations and institutions um, so that we can have a global presence and beat back the enemies that don't intend to give African peoples any significant fair share of the planet. We have to carve out our share and defend it. And so, Minister Brown, I'm sure you will probably have a follow-up on this. You've been very serious. I understand you want to establish something in these states that would reflect the unbelievable work that you were able to do. And that included filming our response to the ignorant attacks on us, setting up a 50-week course and calling it the Communiversity, African Education in the Community. And that community, we were fortunate to have the luck of one of our great church traditions, and that was the great church that our brother
Johnny Youngblood.
No, before Johnny Youngblood, that Johnny Youngblood came later, but the initial one was with Dr. Reverend Calvin O'Butts.
Oh,
And that
yes.
church was Abyssinian Baptist. And we had in the rectory hall, we had classes, and people came by the hundreds. And each week we had a purchase of 2 books, one on the Caribbean or Black America and one on Africa. So at the end of the 50 weeks, people had the 100 most important books in our experience. And then those who could afford it were able to save their money and travel with us to a pilgrimage to Ghana. And we didn't call it a tourist trip, we called it a pilgrimage. And the Africans in Ghana went along with us, and they called us, they sent letters ahead that the spiritual pilgrimages were coming to go into the slave dungeons, to visit sacred spaces and places. And so we have been blessed to be able to film what we have done. And Mr. Brown has a lot of that filmage. And of course, it also connects with his relationship to Reverend Daughtry, one of our special preacher and preacher families. His wife, Karen Daughtry, is also an evangelist, his daughter and son, grandson. In other words, we have been in the midst of an enormous struggle for the African mind, body, and spirit. And at various levels, we have it. I'm so glad that it's in the level of my immediate family, including my nephews, Hakeem and Hassan, and in the middle of people who helped those get into ministry, like Minister Brown and Reverend Daughtry's relationship, but also our brother, the power couple in Brooklyn. You're talking about Brother Barron and his wife, who was the teacher. And so we have to be, and out of that church came a fight. The Black United Fund became a part of the structure we use to restore Africanness to a special greatness that we're being allowed to lay down and build. So Nana Jeffries has been Mrs. Jeffries has been installed as a queen mother uh, and given the name Nana Abibio. I was installed as a part of the paramountcy of Ogogo, and my name was taken from the Ashanti kings, Nana Kwekujwa Ajiman II of the Gold Stool and Asante. So we have taken these uh, bondings very seriously, and we hope to put some more meat to that story. And we would, and because we have so many instances that people would not believe that they had a 25th anniversary, a silver anniversary in Kumasi of the Golden Stool, and we had a group that went, Brother Smalls, myself, and a whole host of others, and we were sitting up comfortably in the stadium with packed 50 or 60,000 people and 25,000, 50,000 outside that couldn't get in. And but we had VIP seats, and we're sitting in the stadium in our VIP seats, and I'm very comfortable. And then a soldier comes and grabs me and says, "Could you please come with me?" I said, "What's the problem?" So he said, "Just step up here for a minute." And then he said, "I need to make a correction." And I said, "Well, what is it?" He says, "You're wearing your cloth upside down." The image on the cloth was the great king. And he said, "Let me turn your cloth upside right." And he did. And I was glad, because that would have been embarrassing for me. And it would have been more than embarrassing. It would have been a devastation for me wearing the cloth wrong, posing as an African with the cloth and don't know how to wear it. So we sat back, I sat back down, Roz and I were with our group, and then they had the drumming. And then they had the rituals coming in. And then we looked down and we knew that the Golden Stool had arrived. And so fortunately, our people came and got us, the people of Agogo, where we were installed. And they said that you're not supposed to be up here in the grandstand, even in VIP seats. You're supposed to be sitting with your African family on the parade in the stadium grounds. And so they took us out of the stadium ground balcony, and they put us sitting with our paramountcy and the queen mothers and whatnot. And then, of course, Rousing wanted to take advantage of this, especially when in comes the Golden Stool. But before it came Nana Afuasa with her fly whisk, clearing the way for the Golden Stool to arrive. And so fortunately, our friends knew that we were in need of some photos. And Rosalind, being Queen Mother 5x5, the other people were standing in front of her. So they got a chair and allowed her to climb up on the chair. I think she was up on the chair shooting the film, and she had her hand on my shoulder for balance. And so we were able to film our great sister, whose family we are part of, coming in, clearing the way for the Golden Stool, clearing the way for the Queen Mother. So these traditions are alive and well and mean a great thing to us. So this type of experience we've got to somehow to put forth, and all of these international conferences that we had. The First World Festival, we were there in 1966. We left our apartment in Abidjan, traded it with a British young lady. She took our apartment in Abidjan, the Ivory Coast, and we took her apartment in Dakar for 30 days. So we were at the First World Festival at all of the activities. And then I was at that was 66. I was at the second one in 77 in Nigeria. And two of our people eventually helped to put that together in terms of Professor Moda, helped with some of the records, and Brother Taiwo, he was there working in the Nigerian festival. Rosin was writing her dissertation at Yale, so she couldn't take the time off. But we were together again a few years later at the festival in Dakar, and again, and we had a chance to participate in these major sessions. And the beautiful thing was that our group, they asked me to nominate 45 people, have 25 people permanently committed, and have 15 people or so as the backups. But at every presentation, every day, major presentation was made. And every day it was a significant triumph of us, meaning the Africans overseas and the Africans on the continent, coming together. And so it was opened by President Wad of Senegal. And he was hosting it. And so at one particular point, he was given a note from his aide de camp that there are 7 presidents at the airport, and they are waiting for you to welcome them to Senegal. These are presidents of the African nations. And so President Wad asked Renoko Rashidi to come and take his seat as head of this historic program. And he held up Renoko Rashidi's book and said, these are the works that Renoko Rashidi is producing, and they are outstanding. And so he said it would do me a great honor if he would take my seat as I go to greet these heads of state. And I was shocked, because I said, oh my goodness, such an important privilege. Is Renoko ready for it? And he had talked about Renoko's work and what he had done, and Renoko was ready for it. He stepped up, took the seat of President Wad, and began to handle his responsibilities. And in fact, he had a young fellow who came from the Pacific Islands, and he actually brought that fellow in and had him sit with him. And he had the regalia of that fellow. And I believe he later gave it to President Wad.
A crown. He put the crown on his head.
Yes. And President Wad took
Pacific Islands crown on the head of Senegalese
the
president.
So that was the first presentation, the first day. And so there we were, the African Americans, in a significant position with the leading Africans. Then the second day, we had Theophile Obanga make his presentation with some of our people. And because he had been in America and he had been part of the Temple program at Philadelphia with Malefi Asante and others. And then he came back and he went to set up a university in Brazzaville in the Congo. And then,
but on that platform is when Dr. Mario Beatty, who's adept in hieroglyphics, also gave a presentation, and I followed Dr. Beatty.
And also, so you had Dr. Beatty, who was a new Theophile Obanga from Temple University. And then when Obanga came back to help set up the university in Brazzaville, after a few years' political difficulty, and he had to get his family up to Paris to safety. And then he himself was able to get out of Brazzaville thanks to Brother Troy, who was working on his PhD at Temple. And he was able to get out and get to safety. And eventually he came back to America, this time for the West Coast. And they needed a leader with Wade Nobles and Dr. Wade Nobles, and a whole host of others in San Francisco, at San Francisco State. So Obanga was able to take that job for several years. So he's had an enormous experience with Dr. Diop and an enormous experience with our scholars. And so this mixture of Africans and their working with each other is enormous. Wade Nobles made a major presentation. Minoko Rashidi made a major one. I was asked to make a major one. And then they had one involving the females. And that was opened by either my wife, Rosalind, opened it, or Dr. Wade Noble's wife in the wheelchair opened it. But she made a fantastic presentation, Dr. Vera Nobles. It was followed by Rosalind, Dr. Rosalind Jeffries, who made a fantastic presentation on top of hers. And then the African...
and it's not so much I, or look what we have done, but it's as much as we are in a wave being moved by the Almighty, and we end up doing this, that, and the other, but they're people things, people-oriented, apparent people. And so that's very key. It's to know that there's an aspect of Almighty, the universe, the multiverse, and that loves us with such, as a people, with such deep love, and is constantly trying to get us to move beyond ourselves to do things that we don't even understand sometimes what it is. But we can say that we have collected these many, many years. I mean, we're like 85 years old, and we have been collecting, going through these things with the objects and things in storages in New York City and also in New Jersey. And we are still trying to find out what in the world we're going to do with all of this data and material that needs to be in a special place. And where is that special place?
Well, we're working on those type of circumstances. We first have to get we're not the only ones that have this type of collection. Dr. Ronald Walters, he was one of our tiger cubs of Dr. Clark, and his wife Pat had to deal with, when he left and went to glory, she had to deal with how to handle his collection. He had moved from Howard after many years to the University of Maryland, but fortunately there was one of our political scientists who was very astute, and she helped him set up a foundation. And so he was able to make sure that those works that he had collected were properly taken care of. We were fortunate to have in the Baltimore area a brother called, he's one of our unsung heroes. He has a printing establishment, and he also has a son who's 7 foot something, and Paul Coates. He is the father of Ta-Nehisi Coates, who is a giant intellectually and spiritually and in other ways. And so Paul has taken Dr. Ben's work and republished it and given it a proper presentation to the world. Because Dr. Ben did a lot of those things himself. He has also said that we should consider Baltimore as a place, possibly the college there, as a place where that might be interested in the type of library we have.
But meanwhile, we have the legitimate foundation, the Doctors Rosalind and Leonard Jeffries Foundation Incorporated. And so if somebody out there has some funds to help us get all of these little details and things together, we would certainly appreciate it.
And we will, this is my 85th year, and so we will be not celebrating a day, we'll be celebrating the year. And so we will have a campaign asking those who could be of support we'll set it up so that it can be properly handled. And then we also have within our family the folks who should be a part of this in a real way. And so we'll be appealing to inside fundraising potential and outside fundraising potential, and possibly potential coming from overseas, so that then we're not finished and we still have stuff to do. And so we'll be asking people to participate in the process. This is the African Rise. That symbol in Dakar is the rise of African peoples, and we will be continuing that process as we lay the foundations for museum institutions and value systems that can be used by ordinary folk in their day-to-day work, and not leave it to the deep scholars or the deep people immersed in these things. It needs to be a people thing, something for the children and something for the elders. And so we're on a victorious path.
Thank you, Dr. J. I think that, the Metropolitan uh, Museum, to honor or to have the exhibit, which kind of lays out all of the things that you have talked about, and that how do you, I wouldn't call what the Met did a capstone, because y'all forced them to have this exhibit, the African origins of civilization, and all the work and everything that was done. But can you just speak briefly on what that means for the Met to come out and at last acknowledge that all this work that has been done by the African scholars has been correct and true? Can you speak to that a little while?
Uh, yes, but here's the important thing: the Met and their plans, which we really don't know what they are. Their plans are their plans, and if they've been able to make some corrections in terms of the real history of people on the planet and the real folks who produce the great cultures of the river valleys, then we expect the truth to be told in these great institutions, and not propaganda, white supremacist propaganda, and negative, devastating information about African peoples, so that they are doing what should be done. If they decide at some point that they cannot fully commit to this enormous truth, then that's what's going to happen. But what has happened is that our truth has been vindicated, and it needs to be put in our culture in an important way, so that we are passing it on to our babies, to our women, so they don't have to fight to try to be like a TV female image that the Western world has, or they don't have to fight to think that the only thing that's worthy is something that you can put a dollar sign on it. We need to use whatever the Met has said to affirm what our people have done. And that doing is you have to control the socialization process. Africans had a science of how you put values, beliefs, role models in a person's life. And they didn't do it sandwiched between an ad for an automobile and an ad for some kind of something to eat. So we have to take our hands out of this European mess and come up with how can we make sure that we devise a process of raising a human to be the best human they can be, to be a leader, to be the best leader they can be, to be a father, they do not need to watch carbon cartoons to develop values. And if you're going to develop it, they should at least be done with an African perspective. So what we're saying is we don't have a bond with the men. They don't have to give us any rewards. They don't have to give us any acknowledgement. Acknowledge to the world that this truth is real, and then continue on your way and try to find what you can for the for the Europeans. We have seen throughout history that people have their own plans. They may ride your back for a period of time to get where they need to go, but at some point they're looking to have a firm foundation. So you can be aware that they may have a plan to slit your throat and establish their own foundation after riding your back. The world has ridden the back of African peoples, Native American peoples. It's time now for us to set up our processes, our economics, and our culture to work for us. If it happens to interrelate or interconnect with other peoples, then we do it. We do it with the Chinese because they have a big future with the numbers that they have and their location. They're trying to create a new Silk Belt. They had that movement of economics across the world in the old days, across the Gobi Desert and whatnot. They're trying to set up a modern Silk route that they control, going through the so-called Middle East and going through areas that are now controlled by Muslim people, but they're going to have to work out a relationship on their control. They want to use Ethiopia as a base, and they are funding people in Ethiopia to be the base for their new Silk Road route and not an African highway to the future. We have to conceive of a super highway to the future for African peoples. It will allow us to relate to others, but not be others, not be their main partners, not be their main collaborators. They will be doing things in their own interest, with their own values, and for their own cultural reasons. So that we have to look for an independency and out from other people and a dependency on our own. So I don't expect to get anything but the worst because people are envious. They didn't attack us because we were doing something negative. They attacked us because they couldn't handle how we could be enslaved peoples and then come out of slavery and do all the things that we did. A perfect case in point is the Tulsa, Greenwood section of Tulsa, that white folks, out of jealousy, envy, couldn't stand to see Black people achieving in the so-called American dream. And so they let it be known that it's going to become a nightmare overnight. We're going to even bomb the Greenwood section. And then after we did that, we're going to make sure it doesn't rise again. And we're going to run super highways, a new use of technology to destroy Black communities. They did it all over. They did it in Detroit. They did it in Newark, New Jersey. They did it in Cleveland. They did it in Akron. Running highways as a part of a political process to keep Black folk down. So you can't look for people like that who keep their own people down. So we have to keep them at a distance. Use and not necessarily abuse them, but don't allow them to use and abuse us.
Well, Dr. J, it's been marvelous. And I know you've given us about, what, 2.5 hours of your analysis. And I want to thank you. I want to thank Sister Jeffries and Charles, and I mean, it's just been something that we needed, this history, and I appreciate it. So I'm going to let you go.
Okay, but realize, Clemson,
Uh-huh.
that they have the Met, and it's significant. But Nigeria has the ability and the people and the wealth to build a magnificent monument to our cultures and our achievements. Senegal is located in such a place as the crossroads of the world that they've already built several museums. They're going to build another one that on the other side of Africa, the Great Museum at Cairo, built by the English, has been abandoned. It's going to take them 5 or 6 or 7 years, but they've moved out the greatest collection in any museum in the world. They've moved them out with ceremony, with parade, with dance, with ritual, and they're moving them closer to the actual pyramids. And they're creating a multi-billion-dollar museum to house it, so that we don't have to worry about any contracts with the.
I forgot the Ghana Museum.
And which one, Charles?
The museum that the elder is working on in Ghana.
Yes, Africa is also planning to make sure that we have our own museums in Ghana and other places, so that it's going to be a lot of fun for us to figure out how and where to put this culture and make it come alive. And some people will say, well, we can find a spot for you. I'm sure some white folks will say, we can find some place out of space for you to take your asses up there and take whatever thing you think will help you. Take whatever you want to take up. Now, of course, you can't take the pyramids. The Great Pyramid of Giza, we're talking about 2.5 million granite blocks put together over a period of 10 or 15 or 20 years. But maybe we can figure out a way of getting some people from outer space who are related to white folks to do the job. But I'm getting a little light now in terms of levity. But no, we need to look to ourselves for our institutions and organizations. We don't have to model them after anybody else. We have enough experience with them, enough experience that we know we need to do something special. We just need to put away the materialistic purchases that we spend so much money on garbage.
Mm-hmm.
And we should have a plan of putting on the various continents where our people have significant presence, to put the history of that interconnection and plan for the future.
Yes. Again, I want to thank you, and I look forward to another session with you. So at this time, we're going to let our audience know that, I'm just grateful that you're tuned in and watching this presentation. And at this point, we're going to close down.
And allow me to have something to eat.
Yes, thank you.
Luckily, we went out and got our food. We said we would hold it up until we finished the session, but we'll come back. We've got to deal with this whole question of Pan-Africanism and the foundation that it laid for us. So that will deal with what our great leaders thought and how they came together, sometimes in conflict, but they came with the idea of a union. We need a political, economic, and cultural union, and that still stands as a major objective.
Thank you, Dr. J.